So I'm going to present, I guess, the complementary perspective on autism, the female point of view. And I come from perception. Let me see. Okay. So first, just to get the ground, sort of common grounds, what is perception? We typically think of perception as the automatic experience that we have, conscious experience that we have in the environment. But in order to form these complex experiences of seeing, of hearing, the experience we have when touching, what we have to do is not just use the sensory information that is driven by the online stimulation, but we actually automatically integrate all our relevant, well, I'll address the all, our previous experiences. Some of them are recent, some of them are accumulated across years, and altogether they form the percept. And in this respect, perception is not compared with memory. Perception integrates our often implicit memory in a very intuitive and immediate way and determines our experiences, our conscious experiences. Well, some of you have been exposed to this example, which I bring here to illustrate the concept. So I don't know how many of you have a clear perception of what it is that we see now. You're a very nice audience. So those that do not say anything, and that's nice, because if you are exposed to the actual clarified, not the same, but clarified version of a cow, which is, I guess everybody sees a cow now, right? Okay, and now the important part is what is the experience with the previous picture. And the reason I brought this, this example is that I'm not presenting the same stimulation. So the sensory experience is exactly the same. Also, your long-term experience with cows have not changed, but what I have changed is a recent example. And you've updated your predictions implicitly to form an immediate percept, which is probably rich and clear, of a cow. So in a way, this is an example of how recent experiences modify our percept, particularly in this case, for things that we have long-term expertise with, okay? This is not specific to the visual domain. I can give you similar examples which are very effective in the auditory modality. I guess most of you have not had a clear percept of what has been said now, but if I present a nice, clear version.
The man's painting a sign.
Which I hope you can all perceive, right? Or just
the man's painting a sign.
And now let's hear the original version. And again, a recent experience has clarified our overall percept. An important aspect is that we need to have long-term experiences because we have to have some pre-existing perceptual category in order to update it with recent experiences, like the one, let me see that I'm presenting the right one. Oh, this is not. Okay, I want to give you another example. Okay, it's another version. I guess you don't hear it clearly. This is the clear version.
הכביש היה חלקלק.
I don't think it's clear for everybody because it's Hebrew. And the point is that I hope it works, that if I now present you the less clear version, those of you who have long-term expertise with Hebrew will have a clear percept, and those of you who don't, even though you have the same recent experience, will not have a clear percept because you don't have a pre-worked out category of this stimulus. So I think the idea here, just to summarize these two examples, is to give you a notion of the importance of both recent experiences and accumulative experiences. Accumulative experiences, in this case, are for Hebrew speakers that are not shared by non-Hebrew speakers, and the impact of recent stimulation. Sorry. I don't know why. Okay. Slide, next slide. Okay, so just to summarize, and these will be the two issues that I'm going to dwell upon and try to show you how they differ across populations and how different types of learning affect big things in life, like being autistic or like being with dyslexia. And what I've tried to exemplify is the effect of accumulative cumulative experiences, like expertise with Hebrew, expertise with cows, and known categories, and how the expert who has these nice and rich representations can quickly update with new samples and rich, nice and rich perception based on very little information. And also the recent information, which allows us to update our predictions, just like here, update our predictions, given the specific context with which we are at. We studied these things, but we used a much simpler version. We used a simple version of serial discrimination, in our case of tones, and participants, let's say you now, for one trial, are asked to tell which of the two serially presented tones has a higher pitch. And this task is known to be, or at least traditionally been considered, as kind of assessing basic low-level audition. However, we use it in a very, very different manner. We use it in a way as a window to understand how we accumulate the experiences, and in this case, the experiences of series of tones that are presented in our lab. Pam, 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 pam. And as we go along in the experiment, you have gradually accumulative experience. And it seems to be strange because these are simple, to some people not too interesting tones. However, being physically very simple, these are pure sine waves, people have not experienced them before. So you don't have, people who come to the lab do not have long-term accumulative experience with these specific tones, so we can determine both their short range and their long-term expertise with these kinds of tones. So how can we utilize this task to learn how people learn the environment? This is just a simple illustration. Let's assume that these are the two tones, so this would be frequency, this would be time, the two tones serially presented in a trial. What happens to be the case is that by the time you present the second tone, and a person has to decide which of the two tones has a higher pitch, the first tone is not really represented in our mental representation, in our internal representation, as it was originally presented, but it has already been integrated with our prediction before it was presented to what's going to be the case. And typically, let's assume for now, I'll elaborate on it, that these predictions are that the next tone, before this was presented, is the mean of previous tones, meaning that we tend to perceive the first tone as closer to the mean of the previous tones that were presented. In a minute, we'll see how we calculate, how we as perceivers calculate and form this mean, but let's for now assume, okay, we have the mean. By now, by the second tone, we perceive this one as closer to the global mean, to the previously presented stimuli, and then it affects responses of the participant, because if by now the participant perceived this tone as closer to the mean, this difference is going to be perceived as larger than it is, meaning the percent correct, if it's a challenging task, will be increased. However, if both tones in this case are above the mean, but the first tone is higher than the second tone, remembering it as closer to the average will degrade our performance. And this means that we can compare percent correct in these two types of trials. They have the same intertone difference in terms of frequency, so they're equally difficult. However, the history is different. And in this case, we'll have larger percent correct for this type of trials, where the first tone is closer to the average than for this type of trials. So in a very basic way, we can utilize this difference to tell to what extent people have used history. If the difference is larger, you've used history to a larger extent, and if the difference is smaller, you've used it to a smaller extent. We can also do it separately for different trials in the recent past. To what extent the most recent trial affected our judgment, the trial before that, the trial before that. So suppose the recent trial was very low, two tones were very low, it would pull the first tone lower, and then it would modify our responses in one way. However, the trial before that could have a different frequency, etc., and we can calculate the different relative effect of different trials, most recent one before, and all the other trials, and see to what extent or how did we build up our expectations across trials and time. What we see when we look at the proportion of inference of history at the general population, and of course in this case for us general population is the students that participate in our experience, in our experiment, we see that the first tone in history, the most recent one, had a larger effect than previous one, and yet all the previous earlier ones had an accumulative larger effect. So there's a recency effect, which means that the most recent event had a larger effect compared to the other events, and also there is an accumulative effect that is gradually increasing throughout the experiment. Beyond the relative effect of the first and second and third, etc., back into history trials, we also wanted to see to what extent we use the rich information. Suppose we distribute the stimuli differently. We can decide on how we present different frequencies. We can present frequencies that have the same probability across different ranges. We can present frequencies that are B-model, etc. This is very informative in terms of how the world look like. Do we actually use this information? And trying to figure out whether we actually use this information turned out to be quite a big project that had took collaboration between Itai, the student who worked on it, and two people from UCL, Vincent Adam and Manish Sahani, who was the senior collaborator in UCL. And following quite a long time, we managed to decipher to what extent we use the overall history or the overall information that we present along the experiment. It turns out that we use roughly all of it. This was a big surprise for us, for me. Let me give you just an example of what I mean by that. Suppose we decide to design an experiment where the frequencies are evenly distributed along all this range. So this has uniform probability, but we only take frequencies from this range. There are no higher frequency and there are no lower frequencies. Okay, I'm showing the cursor to myself. I didn't realize that you don't see it. Okay, so this is uniform. Can you hear me? That's great. So this is uniform distribution in the sense that we put all the frequency in this range, but there's no frequency here, there's no frequency here. Meaning that if you know the distribution, if you know the world, your best policy is if there is a response that seems to be interpreted as if the stimuli came from this range or from this range, you should pull your predictions into the range where stimuli are presented. So this means that you have to have an expectation function that looks like this if you actively use all the information there is. In order to tell where we actually use all the information that one could use, we presented, well, we don't have 600,000 participants, which is but we presented it to participants of Amazon Turk, which is several hundred participants. Some groups got this distribution, some groups got this distribution, by model distribution, or this kind of distribution. And what we found is that for each distribution, best policy would be to use the information optimally in a different way. And what we found is that all participants, so this is the best policy, just as I explained here. All participants, if you don't get to the details, this is fine. The whole idea is that these are different distributions of frequency. For example, these are bimodal. Frequencies cannot be taken from here. And in that case, participants should not have their prior, should not expect stimuli to come from the mean range, which has zero probability for having any stimuli. And what we find is that what you should compare is these lines to these optimal performance lines, is that overall people perform optimally, showing that they utilize all the information that is implicitly presented. They could not report this distribution, but they actually judge optimally based on this distribution. So if I just summarize the whole concept, what we do is we present serial stimuli, and we use the pattern of responses of participants to decipher how they learned the distribution of the stimuli. The recent stimuli, they are more affected by recent stimuli, but they also accumulate very rich information from the overall distribution that is presented in the experiment. And this whole thing was in the context of trying to understand, as Eva presented, is this also the case for people with developmental dyslexia? And the reason we got to it in the first place is that we conducted experiments that suggested that people with developmental dyslexia do not use this information as effectively as other people, as good readers. So the first thing we did is trying to understand, okay, now this is better. So this is the same kind of histogram that I showed you before, but to what extent, so blue is the control and red are the dyslexics, to what extent people use the most recent event, which is higher than 1 before and 2 before, and to what extent they use all others. So individuals with dyslexia, when performing the two-tone task, they use the same pattern in most recent event. But if you look at how earlier history affected their responses, they were less affected by earlier history, meaning that even though originally they could use it, there was some decay, implicit decay of memory in their representation of previous stimuli. So now the question, is it relevant? I mean, we're using this two-tone discrimination task, which kind of, how is it interesting? And to test whether this kind of pattern also characterizes their reading pattern, we administered the following experiment. So these are words in Hebrew. These are non-words, actually. And participants are asked to read them as fast as they can. Even those who do not read Hebrew can see that these are the same words. So if you have the same word repeated, you read it faster. And then there is a repetition of this word, but with a larger interval. You still read it faster than the first time, but now the interval is larger, so if there is a decay, there is a reduction in the benefit from repetition. Now we asked, is the reduction in benefit from repetition faster in dyslexia? Because there's a faster decay of this information in dyslexia compared to control, and this is what we find. When we look at the advantage of a second time reading, it's not small, it's about 160 milliseconds. In word reading, it's quite a bit. But if you look 5 seconds later, like this interval, well, controls also show reduction, but their reduction is much smaller in the sense that, yes, the pattern we see in two-tone discrimination is very similar to the temporal pattern of memory decay that we see in two-tone and in reading. This is the kind of challenging presentation. Let me tell you what, oh, I'm just debating whether, how much time do I have? Okay, I have 2 minutes to explain what we are seeing, which is a bit challenging. So we used this experiment, we did this experiment. We did the two-tone, it's all about two-tone discrimination, but two tones were bimodal. So they could either be in this range or in this range, but there was no tone ever presented in this range. And then we asked, do participants get it in the sense that they do not expect tones in this range? And what happens, these are the controls. And what you expect to see is that they contract, they expect towards this area or towards this area, but they never expect it to be in the unpresented area. This is also the case presented with the same kind of stimulation in the dyslexic group. However, the dyslexic group, this is optimal performance, and this is the dyslexic performance. They do not, in a way, implicitly get that there are two independent ranges here, and they do not expect it to be in this range. Or, sort of summarizing it, we don't see this usage of detailed information in the pattern that dyslexic use the two-tone distribution along the experiments, which means that the aggregation of long-term distribution of stimuli is reduced, impoverished, is not only smaller, it's also impoverished in resolution in the dyslexic group. However, when we look at the performance in the most recent effect, it's very similar, it's very nice, it's very limited in the range, just like the controls. Again, if we ask, how is it expected to affect dyslexics' long-term performance in the range of expertise or failed expertise that we know for dyslexics? You may recognize Eva from introducing me and introducing Simon before. And here we asked, let's assume they really have a difficulty in retaining and accumulating information across long windows of time. How can we see it? Because nobody ever tracks people. Well, I don't have the prenatal data or how to compare the performance to very early, but we can sort of, in a way, bypass the long-term expertise or the long-term experience. what we can do is compare performance to stimuli that throughout life you were not exposed to so many times, and stimuli that you were exposed to many, many times, okay? Based on our observations, we expect that dyslexics will have specific difficulties with the more frequent stimuli, because for them, people become experts, and they are not as expert because they do not accumulate as effectively as non-dyslexic individuals. And this is what Eva tested here. One of the main characteristics of dyslexics is that they have poor, what is called poor short-term memory, meaning if you're asked to repeat a series of items, the number of items they can repeat is smaller than those of the general population. We now predicted that this will only be correct for very common items for which we are all experts, because we have lots of long-term expertise and we have better representations of these long-term experienced syllables, in this case syllables. So what we did is do this span task, like you repeat after me, ba, shu, da, ga, le. Okay, these are all common syllables in Hebrew. These are CV consonant vowel syllables. And we assume that with consonant vowel syllables, people will do better than with vowel consonant syllables, which is ab, ub, ud, eg, ik. You get the picture? You're asked to repeat as many as you can, and people repeat fewer items when it's a VC, which is less common, not now, not recently, but in their long-term expertise, and then they have a smaller span. The difference in span between dyslexic and non-dyslexic population applies only to the CV, but not to the VC syllables, meaning that the deficit is increasing with accumulative experience and for things you're expected to be an expert in, which is not surprising, as reading is something we all acquire expertise in. How is it all related to autism? So when I say autism, and here people have asked about different types of autism, I refer to what was previously called Asperger. And previously called Asperger means a sub-part of the autistic population, about a third, who do not have a language difficulty, whose functioning is quite high, but they have severe social difficulties. So they don't have a reading difficulty, they don't have a language difficulty, but they have a social difficulty. How is it expected to be manifested in how they perform two-tone discrimination? What's the relation? So this is what we actually asked. And what we found is just the opposite pattern. What we found is if we do exactly the same analysis, so we compare the contribution of the most recent trial, second earlier, third earlier, fourth earlier, and all the previous trials that you were exposed to, we don't find any difference in the accumulative ability, in the magnitude of all aggregated information. However, the most recent event hardly affected individuals with autism. So we found complementary patterns of using the history, where individuals with autism hardly use very recent history. However, if they're given enough time, they gradually accumulate all the information in the sense that I've shown you before. They show very nice cumulative performance. They show very nice usage of the distributions that we perform. They form rich categories, maybe systematic categories. They form very rich categories, but it takes more time. If I just the same kind of analysis using roughly the same conditions, we find here difference, no difference here. Here there's a large difference, but there's no difference here. Is it related to so it's the same thing. Is it related to the pattern of their behavior? So let me first, following this observation, we asked, okay, if this is a general thing, another thing which is known for individuals with autism is that they have sensory motor difficulties. So they have social difficulties, but they also have difficulties, for example, in getting driver license. Okay, this was not expected, but now try to tap with the tone. Okay? It wasn't, I don't know why. But anyhow, they have difficulties getting a driver's license in the sense that they have difficulties in all sorts of sensory motor activities that require online performance, that require, if you're driving and somebody gets into the road, you have to respond very quickly. So now we asked, will we see the same pattern of deficit in the lab. How do we sample? What is our proxy for sensory motor online updating? This is what we did. So this is like a metronome, just the one you heard, tuck, 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 tuck. And then the metronome changes beat, okay? These are the intervals. They're about half a second. And this is when participants tend to tap. Typically, when we think or when we perceive our taps just as synchronous to the external stimuli, it means we're slightly ahead. This is interesting. It's not known why, but this is a very common phenomenon. So anyhow, what we asked is, suppose we change the beat. What's going to happen with the autistic participant? If we change the beat from tan, tan, tan to tan, 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 will they be able to track online and update the changing beat? And as you can see here, they don't. This is the metronome. It's tuck, 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 tuck. Okay, the interval becomes longer. This is the interbeat interval. It's around 500 milliseconds, twice a second. It gets longer. This is what happens with the control participant. Of course, here you cannot track it yet because you don't know when will be the next change because it changes. However, within 2 beats, they manage to track. This is the control participants. However, I don't know why it changes. However, the participants with autism in green, they don't manage to track the changes. So roughly, they're on the right beat, but when there are changes, they don't manage to keep up with the changes of the beat that occurs there. And in this respect, we are witnessing exactly the same phenomenon. There are changes, and they have to update within half a second, 2 seconds, and they do not manage to do that. And interestingly, this idea or this observation of slow updating within the range of half a second, 2 seconds, which is very relevant to social interactions, relevant to sensory motor interactions, to change or stop your car if somebody enters into the road, has not been proposed before. As Simon has suggested, other theories have been proposed before. However, if we look, this is just few papers that I got from relatively recent observations. Simon talked about global processing because we're not good. Individuals with autism are very good in local, and if you remember, you had a local example how we are good in detecting local stuff beyond the global context. This is one of the characteristics of autism. Can we explain it? Is it some additional phenomenon, or this is something which is explainable by our potentially explainable by our observation? I would like to say yes. One of the predictions is that this is what you'll find. However, the reason that we have differences like individuals with autism have specific difficulties is they'll do well whatever does not require integration and updating that takes time. Does it account for it? So it's just an example. This is a meta-analysis of local global visual processing, which you've been just introduced to in the previous talk. And what they find is the slow global processing in individuals with ASD. Just make it short. It's not about global versus local. It's about the time given for participants in order to integrate information. If you don't have enough time to integrate information, you have half a second rather than what they would like to have a second or 2 seconds, you will not do it. So again, we think it goes a long way in explaining other unrelated, seemingly unrelated phenomenon. And this is an observation of a clinician not very long ago. A word changing too fast for miswired brain, coming from a completely different observation, clinical observation, that was the idea. Let me just summarize. How long do I have? If I have more time. So I will show you just more slides. Just one more slide. I want to summarize what I've said so far is that patterns of inference in simple serial discrimination, how you infer from the series of tones that you have been presented recently or 2 seconds or 3 seconds and years before, can tell you how you learn the world, which is very interesting because it suggests that how we learn the world in one modality, like in tones, tells us a lot how we learn about the world in other modalities, as if there's some common mechanisms of learning in time. Some people put more emphasis on recent events, like individuals with dyslexia. They will be good in online interactions, but they might be poorer in integrating information, statistics that might be useful, for example, for decoding the written speech, the written words. However, some individuals will be slow in updating, but will be able to accumulate detailed information which may explain some of the tendencies or systematic tendencies of individuals with autism to collect lots of information that is not often updated. So they have detailed information, but they do not have to quickly update it. Since I have 2 more minutes, I will just give you one more slide because I wasn't sure whether I'll get to it or not. And this is, can we say anything about what happens in the brain, how the rate and the implicit learning of the external statistics occurs in the brain? And what we find is that we think that the relevant phenomena is very, very well known, and it makes sense because I'm talking about learning that goes on all the time, and this is adaptation. And Ellie's lab has been studying related phenomena quite a lot, and what do I mean by adaptation? The fact that, let's say, neurons, but it occurs all over the place, if you present exactly the same stimulus with a very small time interval, the response to the next stimulus will be smaller. And this is a form of implicit memory. Why is it implicit? Because it's not that you necessarily explicitly remember it or can produce it. We have to be presented with the second time in order to detect that it has been presented. And there's something specific to it, because if the next stimulus is very, very different, there will not be adaptation. It is to some extent, to a large extent sometimes, stimulus specific. So this is a learning mechanism that we can track through the reduction of responses to the same stimuli. If this is the mechanism, what we are suggesting is that the duration of adaptation, okay, the time interval until which you will still respond smaller to a second repetition is shorter in dyslexia because it decays faster, and is longer in autism. It takes you longer to adapt because, why? Because, what is the basic level? We don't know, but we can measure it through slower adaptation. If you will be presented with the same stimulus only following 2 seconds, you will respond, if you're an autistic person, with the same magnitude of response. However, after 3, 4, 5 seconds, you will decrease your response, and this decrement will last longer than it lasts in the general population and reflect the pattern of implicit retention of these memories. When I look at this picture, I think it's a bit complicated. So this is how it's shown. If I have time in the questions, I'll get to details. But we find the same. This is the general population. This is dyslexics. You can see that it's different. OK, I'll say one sentence to clarify a bit. I'm sorry, just a bit מתוננת. So what we see is, like, if we have the stimuli in an interval of 1.5 seconds, this is the response. 3 seconds, this is a response. 6 seconds, this is a response. 9 seconds, this is a response. Because you grow out of adaptation, your response to the second stimulus increases. So this is about the dynamics of adaptation, and this is roughly a replication of the same effect. If you're an individual with dyslexia, of course, this is general average of a group, then this is the response to the 1.5 seconds. This is to the 3. This is a large increase, okay? But by the 6 and 9s, you're already about the same. So here, the large jump is from 3 to 6. Here's the large jump is from 1.5 to 3, okay? So here is roughly where the adaptation ended, and it ended faster earlier after something like 6, 7 seconds in dyslexics, and in control it's lasted longer. In ASD population, everything is kind of more adapted because we do many, many stimuli. But between 1.5 and 3 seconds, there's hardly any difference in the sense that introducing close by stimuli do not increase these individuals' adaptation. Or just to summarize, this takes longer. With 1.5 seconds, there's no increase in adaptation. It takes longer to adapt, but it lasts longer. So even with 9 seconds, individuals do not go back into very, very large response, just very, very different from the pattern of adaptation that we see in the dyslexia population, and we find the same observations when they perform a task or when they just watch a movie and are presented with stimuli, and they do not have to attend to anything, suggesting that the whole effect is quite automatic and relates to different dynamics of the networks and its patterns of integrating memories. And I think I'm done here. Thanks.